If you are not a nationalist, you are not a journalist.
The print media came in opposition to the British colonial rule, and they were articulating something like the nationalist view. And yet there was no one nationalist view at all.
There is a ray of hope, I'll say. Two hopes I have, and that is with the independent journalists these days, and the second is universities. And thankfully there are like spaces which still debate this phrase that if you are not a nationalist, then you cannot be a journalist.
Thought-provoking insights sparking intellectual curiosity. Tune in, transcend the ordinary, and get nuanced.
How do we make sense of objectivity and subjectivity? That's something that we are going to talk about in this particular conversation that we are having on the question of biasness or neutrality of the news media.
Dr. Prof, as I started my career as a journalist. So when I entered the field, and before that, I was there in a media school, we were trained how not to be biased in our content generation, or especially when we go to the field, when you are talking to people, how to keep aside your biases. But when we entered the field and we started hitting the ground, I realized one thing, that the biasness is not only about a reporter. It is also about who is standing behind the camera as well. So that is the second level. I mean, when we are talking about biasness, let's also touch upon what type of biasness are we talking about. Are we talking about the reporter's biasness? Are we talking about the camera person's biasness because he's or she's also capturing with a particular viewpoint? The camera person might not or might take record something with a particular angle, and that might give a very different meaning altogether to a particular story. The third level then comes at the editing table. Who is editing? So editor becomes the third point of contact, or third level of biasness. And the fourth one is also about the bureau chief. Whether the bureau chief will accept the story or just drop the story. All depends upon that. But the story doesn't stop here. It goes beyond, and which is known as under which banner are we working as a reporter? That is the media ownership. So there are different levels of biasness that we have to, first of all, we have to acknowledge that yes, there are biasness, but how these biasness at different levels, either they merge with each other or they just overpower each other. So that is exactly where, this is what I encountered while working as a journalist.
So I think this is a very complex question to unpack in many ways, right? And there is really definitely no one answer to this. One way of looking at it, I think, is to say that different disciplines or fields, domains approach the question of objectivity differently, right? So whether it's the sciences or the humanities or the social sciences or a field like law or a field like media, right? How does the idea of objectivity work there differs sometimes also in our everyday perspectives. Like, for instance, I'm from the literature background, right? So how do you appreciate something like a text or something like art, right? Can you have an objective view about beauty or a quality of a text? These things get debated, I think, all through in society in various ways. So most often it is not a particular answer we are trying to sort of arrive at, but particular set of standards, right? That if you're from this field, what are the standards to keep in mind while saying is something objective or not. And I think there the point that Dr. Devanjan mentioned, that in journalism schools, journalists are taught that it is important to keep your biases out. And that is coming from this recognition that individuals are products of their society, their sociocultural backgrounds, and multiple things affect them, right? Multiple things form their perspectives and judgments of the world. So obviously we have opinions about many things. It is hard for a journalist to go into the field and not have a judgment about something that's happening, especially if it's a conflict-ridden or complex issue, right? So they will have an opinion, but even after having that, how is it that they can maintain the standards of the field by saying, okay, I will get in as many perspectives as possible, right? Or I will try not to give my opinion before I hear someone else's. And when I write the story, while there will be creativity, I will write it in a way that I say foreground certain facts or arguments and so on, right? So there are ways in which people, I think, try to meet this standard. So I think scholars of media and journalists have, for the longest time, probably said that objectivity is not equal to neutrality, right? It is to live up to a certain agreed upon standards that the media as an institution, as an enterprise of many people working together, have said, look, these are the things we need to somehow meet. And I think that's an important criteria in the 21st century as much as it was probably in the 18th or 19th century when media was developing. So can we sort of say that we no longer care about objectivity? I think we really can't go there, right? If each discipline has a set of standards. So I think this is one way in which I'd start thinking about it, but there's probably much more to say about it. What would you, because you're also from the media background, you've researched and worked in this field. Do you have any take on this at all?
I believe that bias in the present times has become such a pejorative term. And when you talk about bias, it is seen to be something negative. In my opinion, bias is not a bad thing.
Right.
And I don't think that there is a possibility of separating human beings from bias. Mm-hmm. I can give an example of the writings of Gandhi and Ambedkar on the question of caste. Mm-hmm. So if you look at Ambedkar, when he talks about the question of caste, he is biased because he comes from that experience. When Gandhi tries to look at the question of caste, he tries to be a bit objective and dispassionate from the entire experience. But in the end, if you look at the subjective experience of someone who writes about the caste and is coming from that particular experience, it makes more sense to us in the end. So I would say that, first of all, bias is not a bad thing, in my opinion. And the idea of objectivity is a concoction. That is a proposition that I can possibly make. And because being a student of history of media and history of journalism, when we look at the objectivity as being talked about in the context of journalism, we see that it emerged only in the 19th century. So there was this development of technology in the form of telegraph, and that technology made it compulsory for the journalist to be objective, neutral. So the terminology was created, inverted pyramid. Never ever in the history of media or in the history of news production, we have seen something which is outside the context of bias and interpretation. So everything is related to the question of interpretation. Now the point is that where do you locate that interpretation? Is that interpretation aligning with the values of the oppression or aligning with the values of problems in the society, or is that interpretation aligning with the values of rationality or reason or logic? So if we look at the media in the present times, it is completely divided. There is polarization of opinions, there is multi-perspectivism. People are talking about, for example, let's say on the question of the vaccination. How do you try to be objective on the question of vaccination? Right. On the question of vaccination, for example, you are pro-vaccine. Okay. And then that is seen to be something which is a perspective. But in my opinion, I have a bias there. So I think that vaccination is a great thing, and it aligns with the values of science. But then there will be the conservative media which will be always talking about the problems of going for vaccination. So they try to have a kind of a perspective which delves deeper into the both sides of the particular notion. But I think that both sides interpretation is also problematic in the garb of trying to be very objective and neutral. So that is my understanding of the question of objectivity and subjectivity. I strongly believe in the idea that subjectivity is something which is inherent in the functioning of our psychology, in the functioning of our cognitive abilities. On both sides, if you look at the scenario and Indian media landscape, you see that there is liberal media, there is conservative media. So do you think that liberal media is more objective? No, it has its own bias. The conservative media is also having its own ideology. So the point is that whether those ideologies align with the democratic values of the Constitution. So if it is aligning with that, then I can say that, okay, there is an interpretation which is for the betterment of the society. So that is my notion, that bias is not inherently bad. The bias can emerge, for example, women writing. It's basically subjectivity that would matter, as opposed to somebody coming from outside and trying to be very objective. No, I'm a man, I can write a better book about women. So that kind of a thing, I would say that's very important. So my second question to you will be, like, how do you then look at the impact of media ownership on the question of objectivity or the neutrality of the media? If we look at in the context of India, and you have worked as a journalist, and you have worked with BBC as well, even in an organization which is termed as to be very objective and neutral and making a lot of sense to the larger production of the news in the society and in the globe, do you think that there is an element of bias even in the context of BBC, or do you think that there are some organizations which don't have that element of bias? How do you look at this question?
Now, this is a very interesting question. I still remember when I had just started, working in the industry. Now, people used to, especially my relatives, they used to ask me that whether you would be more fine working with the Indian media or will it be the media from the West? And much, organized as in codes as say BBC, because quite old. And BBC is also seen as an organization which tends to, work or emphasize more on the neutrality of the content. Now, but what happens? There are certain testing times as well. For example, when there are wars. Example right now, we are having multiple wars at this moment. Now, where BBC is little different from Indian media is that, for example, at this moment, we three, people are sitting and discussing something. So it's not only about one particular person who is, giving his or her point of view. Now, in BBC, still in most of the shows, what they follow is they tend to have a conversational, show or a, news presentation. So what happens, and there are certain disagreements as well, and it should be, because then what happens, because the viewers are not even. There are, viewers who tend to go with other interpretations or perceptions or their affiliation, right? So what happens in BBC? They try to, come up with or try to balance out that with, at least two people, having a conversation. In Indian media, what I see is actually not very good, neither for the country nor for the industry, Indian media industry. That is, now there is a, past 10 years, if you tend to look at this, format of, presenting news with at least two anchors or two, at least one, what to say, expert or something, right? So there is somehow they have, gone away from this format, and that's why there is so much of criticism of Indian media, because what is happening is then people start associating a particular news channel or newspaper with one particular ideology. Now, thankfully, when you mentioned about Gandhi and Ambedkar, I won't say it was their biasness, but it was their, association with particular, ideologies. But both were constructive towards not only Indian national movement, but also towards the community they were representing. But what is happening, the point of departure now, if you tend to look at, the leaders are also trying to, affiliate themselves with one particular type of channel or news agency. Now, this is something dangerous because during that time, the leaders used to connect with all type of media, irrespective of their ideological bent. They used to have a dialogue. But now that dialogue is somewhere missing, and it is only a monologue. And that is where, I draw my reservation with this idea of biasness in media.
That I could pick up from that one strand that both of you mentioned. There is a general problem and a particular problem that we could dwell on. So, today journalism, media's main role is no longer giving information, because the citizenry, people have information from multiple sources. So it appears like the media's main role is to then give some very enlightened perspectives. So multiple problems crop in there, right? So it's almost like now you don't have any responsibility to sort of hold on to any particular argument. Your responsibility ends when you have got 5 people who hold 5 different perspectives and you've had them debate with each other. So you can appear to have that even-handedness because obviously you've got everybody's perspective and it's there. And that obviously serves the media conglomerates very well, the advertisers, because they also want to reach out to multiple sections of the community. So if you have a far-right, center-right, moderate, liberal, extreme left and so on, and if you had all of them and say something or the other
objectivity.
In the garb of objectivity, if you have this, then you've somehow, it looks like you've met the gold standard of the particular demands of the present. But as Dr. Devanjan was saying, does that amount to any real conversation or deepening ideas about some, issue that society really wants to dwell upon, or concerns that are common concerns, is really an open question. So the contrast between the, maybe we should say the BBC of the past and even probably the BBC of the present, or definitely the media of today, is maybe both fighting it and also giving into this luxury of multiple perspectives amounts to upholding democracy and objectivity. I think the example that you gave of vaccination, also a war, are very good examples, right? Because these are examples where we don't have any settled perspective as such. These are live problems, as it were. So there will be multiple views. Like, I might be pro-vaccination in general, but I might not know whether the COVID vaccines particularly will be effective or not, right? So even within pro-vaxxers, there's maybe very many different views. And anti-vaxxers have many other things to draw upon to say why vaccination is not a good thing. So there, I think it's interesting to pose this question of what is the role of the journalist, right? Is it then to say, okay, I'll get multiple perspectives and then let the audience decide, because that's what they are there to. They want to decide based on very many views. Or do specific media houses or journalists themselves have any responsibility in saying, no, I want to give my view and then let others decide whether my view is good enough for them or not. So I was wondering what either of you thought about that problem. whether it's vaccine or war, where does the journalist's role begin and end, would you say?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right in pointing out that it leads to a kind of relativism, giving a kind of a space to multiple perspectives and making it appear that we are talking about neutrality and objectivity, and we're giving. But in the process of that, you also give space to some of the very problematic elements in the society. Now, for example, in the international scenario, whether you look at United States of America, whether you look at Germany, you have the fascist groups coming in the mainstream, which were termed, even in the context of India as well, the fringe, which was referred to fringe in 90s or 2000s. They are the people who are actually running the discourse and narrative in terms of their circulation of the content in the media. So they're also now controlling, in a way, the media. When you look at, for example, Twitter, Elon Musk siding with Trump, and then obviously it becomes a huge factor for the right wing to proliferate their ideology. Similarly, I would also talk about Jeff Bezos. He controlling the Washington Post. Washington Post otherwise was seen to be something which was known for its journalism, that brave journalism and exposing and investigative journalism. But when the news media, which was the legacy media, which was the best service for so-called society and culture, has come directly under the control of these conglomerates or the business owners, and they directly support the politicians. It becomes a kind of a nexus between politicians, business, and at the end, I think the audiences are at the receiving end. So even if Twitter gives a kind of space to multiple opinions, I would say that still it will allow certain elements which were otherwise regulated, they were not allowed to comment upon. They have also come into the space and they are making the noise, and it is creating a kind of a toxic atmosphere. Like somebody can come directly on your profile and comment whatever they want to, and then you think that it is the democratization, but it also is the dissemination of a radical perspective, which is problematic sometimes. So how do you look at this whole now owning of the media by the leading businessmen in the world, and particularly when you look at the ownership of the media, when you see that women, we have Rupert Murdoch controlling so much of the media, we have other examples that I have given you in the previous point. So what happens to the dissemination, the consumption, and the interpretation of the news in a context like that? And you think that you have all the power as an audience because you have access to multiple perspectives, but then in the end it is Google or it is the large conglomerates which are owning the show, and they are controlling the dissemination in a way.
Absolutely right. Interestingly, most of the, national news channels or media houses at this moment are being owned by these conglomerates. And we all know who are these big organizations. Now what happens is that, there is no issue of these organizations owning media businesses. But the problem starts with when they start, mediating what type of media business model would look like. I'll give you an example. In 2003, Times of India, it started with something known as MediaNet. Now this MediaNet was basically, at that moment, it was only catering to, page 3 section of Times of India. And they were like, why are we giving free, access to Bollywood? Because they are getting a lot of traction because of our publications. We go and, as Times of India is a big group, and we go cover their movies, their reviews, their, audience interaction and whatnot. So they were like, now we are going to charge you. So initially it was not very expensive, I believe, and So even the the celebrities had no issues in paying. But the concept of paid news, this is how in 2003 it institutionalized, right? Now later, in 2005 elections, there are some reports that some paid articles were published in newspapers. Now, in 2005 again, Times of India came up with another business model. Now, this is known as Times Private Treaties, TPT, in short, as we say. You must have read it. Now, TPTs are what? It was a very radical business model at that time, because generally what happens, like when you go to when you approach a newspaper or any newspaper, so there are some rate card. So basically, as per this square centimeter or this space, you have to pay this much of amount of money, and per advertisement you have to pay something. Now, Times of India said that through this Times Media Net, that Times Private Treaties, that we are not going to charge you per insertions or per advertisements. It will be an association of long-term duration, and in return, we are not going to charge you money, direct money. So what they did, for example, if you are an advertiser and you approach me, if I am Times of India, then I will have an association or a contract signed with you for next 5 years. But in return, I will, for next 5 years, I'm going to publish all your articles or, advertisements. But in return, I will take not money, but a part of your share. So what happens now, this is the problem when I'm having, let's say 5% or 2% of your shares. I will certainly like to, have it better valued next year. So what I'll do, I will certainly, as an organization, as a media, I will write all good things about you, because your valuation then next year will go up. So if that goes up, if you benefit, I'm also benefiting, because I'm also having an amount of shares with me. Now, this is how, the whole corporate dominance of the media started in India.
This reminds me of something we teach in media studies. There is this model called propaganda model of Noam Chomsky. Yes. So he talks about these 5 filters. Exactly. One is the ownership of the media. Second is the advertisers. Third is the sources. Fourth one is the flag machines. The fifth one is the ideology. So the news which reaches the audience is basically they have to go through these filters. Yeah, so I think that you address the question of the advertisers in a big way. And do you have any inputs on that?
So I was thinking that, that actually adds this additional perspective in how this network works in this complex ways, right? It is not as if the business houses are directly pumping in their ideology to each journalist, reporter, or even the last administrative worker there. But as soon as you say that, okay, this is the model in which we'll work, I think a lot changes already, right?
Absolutely.
And it's not even like you have to go as far as fudging facts. It's which facts you choose to highlight that changes the game completely, right? So now we are in the age of breaking news. So you could go on about how some attack happened and 4 people from X community died. The fact that maybe 6 people from some other community or some other group died, you can choose not to talk about it at all, right? So there itself, a certain kind of influence has percolated, which does not need this, very sort of straightforward or maybe not interesting way of understanding how ideology or media bias or Nexus works.
So to this, let me also add, when you are saying Nexus, right? Now, very interestingly in media, when I was there, I also saw that a little strange for me at that time, because generally how we were grown, we used to read editorials, and the idea was that the editor is the supreme command. but I don't want to name these organizations, but in 2006-07, they started hiring brand managers. And under brand manager, they situated in hierarchy, a vertical hierarchy, they situated the editor. Now, so the most important thing becomes the brand or the market economy. And to that, I would like to, invite you. What do you think, Dr. Raoof? How economy, you think, has aligned with journalism, or it has overpowered it?
I think that it dictates journalism in the context of Rupert Murdoch, if we talk about its role in UK. So when we look at Sun as a tabloid, when we look at News of the World, these kind of media platforms, the way they functioned, and also the economy is dictating journalism in the way, because tomorrow if Trump is going to have a kind of a policy which is hurting the interests of the business people, I'm sure that they will withdraw their support from. The ideology is not something which is concrete here. So there is a switcher perspective. So Rupert Murdoch is a switcher. He doesn't care whether liberal is in power, whether conservative is in power, but as long as there is no regulation on his business, so he continues to control. Like, he controls Fox, but then in the context of UK, he controls much of the media. There is a decline in the legacy media, but still, I'm saying that economy has, in a way, shaped journalism in a big way.
Market economy.
Yeah, I would say that it is very deterministic. It is directly proportional to that. So that if, for example, Mukesh Ambani is controlling so much of media, and he is going to control 70-80% with the deal that is going to happen between Disney and Reliance. So obviously there is going to be a complete monopoly over the news. And there won't be any journalism. And that is also one of the reasons that people have no interest left in journalism. They don't even read the news. So there is no scope for the business of the news. But maybe we can refer to the emergence of these independent social media stars in the form of like Dhruv Rathi kind of people. They in a way shape and influence the narrative in the society in a big way. So do you have a kind of a response to their role in the society and how they have surpassed the traditional monopolistic tendencies of the bigger corporates? And is it a good thing for us?
That's probably harder question to answer. But of course, we are in the times of what we can call citizen journalists, right? And definitely they have now so it's clear that the big media houses, the mainstream media, we can almost say that they are now only one of the players in how both information is disseminated, discourse is produced, and people think about it, and so on, right? You are no longer dependent on 3 or 4 or 5 set of players to tell you exactly what's happening every day outside in the world or in the realm of politics or culture and so on. So there are obviously these players. So in one way, we can definitely say this is democratization, right? That many people now have voices. And especially, we could also add that many marginal players can now, they just need to have a small setup, they need to have a smartphone, and they can sort of air their opinions. On the other hand, it also sometimes worries us, right? That whether then the quality of our discourse, the quality of our conversations, it becomes so splintered that we don't have enough anchoring points, right? I think this is still debate
Emerging.
That is playing out.
Yeah.
And it's not something you can wish away. It's definitely here to stay. In the light of this, I guess the media house's responsibility probably becomes even bigger, right? What kind of stories they focus on, what kind of deepening of the discourse they do, and so on. so one half of my head thinks like this, right? The other half wants to problematize this also in saying that we really probably can't, I mean, of course, media is thought of as the fourth estate of society, right? I wonder if now after the big businesses have taken over media, we really can think of media as that, like we expect legal institutions to deliver justice, right? Can we then expect media to give us accurate stories about the world? Or should we then just think of them as businesses, right? Who are trying to maximize profit like any other business. So if we hold on to that perspective, I think the emergence of the citizen journalist is a good thing, the social media and influencers, because then you can say that, look, these other individuals are not always looking at getting revenue or advertisement and so on. They're also interested in specific things in which they have stakes. So it's good to hear those voices rather than, only depend on people who are trying to say, okay, where will my profit come from?
Yeah.
So I wonder what you guys, what you all think about it.
This is also something very interesting, and I would like to, when we are talking about citizen journalists, let me also, attach it with regional press, right? For example, there are some very big names, like they are regional come national, like Malayalam Manorama, like Hindu, Dinatanti in the south, for example. They are huge, right? And they have a legacy. They have a tradition going back very, 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 very...
Nadu.
Yeah, exactly. It is going pretty back, in the history. Now, the question is that, for example, Malayalam Manorama, in Kerala, and as we know, like Kerala has the, highest literacy rate. So I was wondering that, of course, these newspapers have a very big role of not only making the people literate, but also informed literate people, right? So in that, I was wondering that do people in a state like Kerala who are not only literate, but also informed, do they actually, are in a position to see the biasness which is coming from the newspapers or journalists or editors or whatever? So what do you, since you come from the same state, so do you have anything to say on that?
In fact, just today morning I was thinking about this, that, most of our views are so much constructed on the mainstream English media that while many scholars might have invested and written about regional medias, it's not something that, I don't know how much of that education percolates into our, universities and journalism schools and our conversations. And I think it's high time it did. Maybe just, from my very limited knowledge and from just observing this as one of those lay audience of these kind of media, beginning from things like Asianet to Malayalam Manorama to many other players, I feel like there you can almost obviously spot which ideological background they have come from.
Yeah.
And that also is a long historical connection. It's not something that has happened in the last 1 decade or so. So no matter if the governments flip-flop in the 5 or 10 years, these associations seem to continue for a long time. And it's consistent with how media has probably developed in India or maybe even the rest of the world, right? Media houses used to be probably sometimes mouthpieces for communist or liberal or other kind of governments. So in the regional spaces, at least specifically in Malayalam, in Kerala, I can see it playing out, and they have therefore also very committed audiences who are so in one way we can say that it's a good thing, because they know that, okay, this debate is playing out in that safe space where we know what are their backgrounds, right? So we can listen to it 24/7 and know what it is going to talk about. I suppose that has also steeped into a lot of English media as well, right? Like an average audience can both pick which news channel is aligned to who. And that is simultaneous, I guess, also with, when you were earlier talking about Trump and so on, I was survey people did that over the years, people's trust in media in general has sort of come down.
So, Elizabeth, you were referring to the regional media and something which is very rich about India in terms of its media landscape. And as you said, that there are scholars who have worked on regional media and have highlighted the importance of focusing on the regional media as opposed to confining our perspectives on English media. So that's a kind of a bias which has always been there. But in the context of this whole, the plurality of the media spaces in India and the kind of celebration that we have for a kind of awe that we have for the multiplicity of the media channels, I would say that that is also going to shrink in the future. So if we look at the example of United States of America, there were like these 60 organizations controlling most of the media. But with time, only 6 media organizations are controlling 90% of the media. So similar kind of a situation is going to emerge there in the context of India as well, where the bigger conglomerates in the form of this merger between Disney and Ambani, it's going to subsume all these regional categories in a way, and it will weaken them in my perspective. I don't know whether that is going to happen, but that's the kind of a perspective I have about the regional media. So it is rich, it has to be celebrated, it has been there, it gives space to multiple perspectives, but at the same time, there is a shrinking of that monopoly, of that space. There is also that shrinking of that ownership, that there are fewer players who are going to control most of the media. So my next point is about who is a journalist in the present day India. What kind of people are the journalists? When we look at the newsrooms, when we look at the television news channels, do you think that it is representative of Indian socio-political that demography, or do you think that there are certain types of people or certain kinds of individuals who come from certain backgrounds, they are dominating the newsrooms in India? So can we talk about that? Can there be justice to this whole idea of neutrality and objectivity as long as we don't fill people from different multiple backgrounds? So what is your take on that? What do you think? Do you think that our newsrooms are very democratic in terms of their location, in terms of their demographics? Who is part of the newsroom?
So, Dr. Raoof, a very interesting question, and although very important question to answer, because when we are talking about diversity in media or diversity in a newsroom, unfortunately, there's not much demographic representation or equal weightage given. For example, in news media industry, the newsrooms, if we tend to look at, more than 70% of the journalists holding the important or influential positions all belong to the upper caste, they all belong to upper caste. Now, of course, that is basically what gets reflected when we see there is exclusion of, focus on stories that comes from the oppressed section of the society. So that is a big problem, especially in the Indian newsroom, I'll say. Secondly, if we go beyond news media to entertainment media as well. Now, for example, the most popular, news media media organizations, or production houses you tend to see. Again, we have to look at, who are those people or the background of those people who are in the decision-making positions. I'm not talking about the assistant directors or, something like that. But if you tend to look at, people who are in production especially into, very, very influential places or positions. Again, upper caste people. And if you tend to look at, although now there is challenge, things are changing a bit. People earlier, it was if you go back a decade back, the upper caste Punjabi, people were dominating the Bollywood or the production houses. Now there is a shift, and you'll see a lot of diversity which is coming. For that, I will try to give, little, what to say, because of the OTT platforms, and people are wanting a little more diversified content for them. And that's why, because of these diversified content, the production houses are also, employing people from those diversified backgrounds as well. I don't know. I won't say that it is out of compulsion, but it is good because the OTT is giving such a good, competition. People are from different backgrounds are coming, but still there's a lot of work to do, and there is still a wide gap between the privileged section of the society who are controlling these newsrooms or these production houses' decision making. So yes, a lot of things need to be done. Yeah.
Thank you for that response, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I'd add another layer to that perhaps. And this, without immediately referring to the Indian context, if you look at, for instance, the American context, yeah, most of the probably media was dominated by the upper class, Ivy League educated, individuals. Which is why I guess it's not even wrong to say that most of them also came from a liberal, background and held that liberal view for the longest time. And it's even possible to say something like, even as far as, let's say, Trump's first election presidency campaign, they were probably actively trying to see how the Democrats could win, right? From there, I think things have gone so far as to say that it doesn't matter what the media says. Those things don't seem to affect didn't seem to affect the campaign at all. So that question, I guess, comes back to us in a couple of ways. Today, what has happened is that multiple ideological or other positions have sort of wedged their way into mainstream media. And said that, look, if largely it was left liberal, now you'll have to sort of hear everybody's voices and so on. But the way it has crept in, we know what kind of sort of upheavals it has left in its background.
These categories such as gender, caste, religion intersect with the newsroom functioning in the context of India? Yes.
It intersects in the same way as it would in, I think, many disciplines, right? So we tend to think that, okay, if we have addressed the gender bias, then automatically we have also got, of course, that's diversity of one kind, right? And at least in mainstream English media, we can see that there are a lot more women journalists now probably than compared to.
But then that intersectionality question, how do you look at the composition or the background of all those women? Are they coming from the OBC background or marginalized background? Or
I think it's easy to agree with what Dr. Devanjan was saying earlier, that it is clear that they aren't. You know that most of them are coming from upper caste backgrounds, right? But therefore, I wouldn't go so far as to say that they are exclusively representing the voice of the upper class and upper caste. And this takes us back to the first question that we asked about bias, right? Bias is very, meaning it is not on your face, at your face, right? It is so percolated into the many things we do and say. It's so subtle that just for that, it is necessary that we have people from, let's say, many regions, many backgrounds, caste, class, gender backgrounds, right? Because it is true that what we have grown up with, what we've learned, what we have imbibed, we will tend to sort of put that in the forefront. So, I mean, I wonder if media houses are very conscious of this in the way, let's say, educational spaces are conscious of it, right? Now more and more educational spaces, either by way of policy or otherwise, are conscious of the fact that we need diversity of students, diversity of educators and perspectives. I wonder how much that question of diversity comes in the media space at all. It might come in the way of focusing on stories. So at least the good, I mean, we are all always in the search of good media channels, right? Where we feel like there is some quality discussion or stress on stories which are coming from multiple places is happening. And I think, at least for me, I mean, personally speaking, I think I am happier with channels or print media, whether it's print or electronic or digital, where I feel like there is equal or at least some sort of effort at going to multiple places, listening to multiple stories, rather than mainstream a couple of things as breaking news, right? So I think that diversity does come into the picture. So I feel that the question of diversity shouldn't just be brought down to the
demographics.
Yeah, the demographic diversity, because diversity is also a very complex question in my opinion.
I completely agree. I mean, like, and just to add quickly to what you said, that yes, there are different layers to that, we have to problematize what is diversity, especially in newsroom. One thing which really disturbs me of Indian newsroom, it's fetish, it's love for, or you may say fetish for white skin anchors. I mean, most of the anchors, if you tend to...
AI anchors which have come
they are all white skin
times.
anchors. I mean, in fact, when I was there in the newsroom, I won't name the organization, but at that time, the criteria of selecting the prime time anchors especially was it should be a woman with straight hair, black straight hair, and white skin tone. So, and still, I mean, it's more than 10 years that I've out of this active journalism, but the same
racism
it is there. Racism is there. It is their newsrooms fetish with white skin, which is I mean very unfortunate.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, sorry to interrupt, the question of diversity also connects back to what you were saying earlier about the regional players, right? Regional media. You were right in saying that that space of difference is sometimes shrinking. It might stay as long as regional politics itself is robust. So as long as there are regional parties which have, let's say, other ideologies or which can sort of give some kind of run for their money to central national parties, these media channels will also sort of follow them and try to create these alternative narratives. But where that space will shrink, I guess then even the channels, what they focus on, what kind of questions they raise, will also I assume that there's a direct connection right now. But as we said, this is something that we probably have not invested enough scholarly energy in, academic energy in, to try to even understand how these things pan out, or to even bring those individuals into conversations. Like, when we have these events at university levels or so on, we rarely invite people who are from other backgrounds, who work exclusively in regional languages, and how they look at many questions, including that of politics or society or culture. I think that is one gap that it should start getting filled up in spaces of learning, much more than it's a simultaneous activity. It has to happen in multiple places for it to be effective, for these voices to be heard. Yeah.
So we'll go to our final question.
Sure.
The question is about how do we situate our discussion on objectivity and subjectivity and the bias with respect to the question of state. When state has become so powerful, pervasive, and it can get anywhere now. It has become more powerful in the times we live in because of the technologizing of the social, cultural, political spaces, and there is more surveillance, I would say, in terms of the engagement that state has with the technology, and it is possible because of the technology. So how do we look at the question of the objectivity of the journalists? How can they be objective when they have that much of control? They know that the tentacles of state are very powerful, that it can reach out to them all the time. So can they afford to be objective in a situation when there is this huge control of the state over the lives of the people? So has it also silenced voices in a way in the present times, or do you think that we can afford to actually convey and articulate our perspectives even in the present times?
It tries to. Yes, the state obviously wants, as you were mentioning Chomsky earlier, it does try to manufacture consent with as many places and spaces in society as it can. But I would still hold on to some sort of optimistic view, insofar as if we can go to not Chomsky but Foucault's notion of power, right? I think media is also one of the sources of power, and it is something which simultaneously functions with the government, the executive, the legislature, and so on. And it has its own ways of trying to give a competition to these other power holders or stakeholders or interest holders, right? And the journalist's voice the individual journalist or the particular media house's voice can sometimes be bought, but the entire enterprise's voice can't be controlled in that sense.
If you are not a nationalist, you are not a journalist. So
right.
That kind of, I think that feeling is existing there in the.
One reason why people probably hold this opinion is because the earliest nationalist media, the media in the print, at least the print media, came in opposition to the British colonial rule, and they were articulating something like the nationalist view. And yet there was no one nationalist view at all, right? People were talking about these many diverse things, ranging from agriculture to caste to to what kind of nation building should we do, right? So being let's say, if we want to hold on to the word patriotic, or holding on to society's concerns, is not the same as some individual's notion of what it is to be nationalist, right? If you are, of course, media is nationalist insofar as it is trying to raise the nation's voice. So yes, unless you are a nationalist, you are not a journalist, yes, because you are raising the society's concern. But it definitely cannot be one view of what it means to be a nationalist?
Absolutely. That's the key question.
Yeah. So in that sense, I guess I'll finish with saying that in that sense, to come back to that question of subjectivity, in that sense, if we go back to this notion of how the individuals in society, like the citizen journalists, like the ordinary individuals, they also problematize this notion of what it is to be, nationalist, what it is, what kind of view can it uphold. So it seems like the power lies not just in the state, but also in that individual entity who can sort of shake up the elements of this government in some way or the other. So, yes, the state is much larger and invisible and can sort of target individuals, and yet it can never have that power that it will sort of silence and control the entire population of at least 1.4 billion. So I think there's still
so
a lot.
Why do you think are the rankings of India so low in terms of the table that we have for Reporters Without Borders? Do you think that it is not a reflection of the larger silence?
So there is no way of escaping that things probably have gotten bad. But I also remember the same statistics telling us that ever since 2003, we have been above 100. We have not been below that, right? So it is not as if the media state has been the exclusive contribution of this particular government which is existing. Have things become much worse in the last 1 decade? I think we all have our opinions about it, and it's easier to say that the more the business elements who have a certain kind of orientation come into play, the more these things shrink. What I was trying to say was that while the statistic is there, the fight is still on also. It is not as if people, we still sometimes switch on those news channels and see both individuals and groups having those conversations which to us look courageous enough in these times. So I think that is at least one way of sort of telling younger people why they should still aspire for this profession. And
there are
look
these
towards
laws from the colonial times. When we look at the law of defamation or libel or sedition, so all these laws have been part of the colonial rule, and then they were inherited by the post-colonial Indian state. And that also in a way becomes a major factor in terms of creating these regulations and patterns and norms in terms of controlling the content when you want to do a certain type of journalism in the country. So I would say that as long as we don't in a way interrogate those legislations of the past and try to make any kind of amendments to the colonial laws, there is a possibility that will continue to have bad rankings in the press freedom. So what is your opinion and take on this particular question? And we will conclude with that.
Now as a sociologist, what I see or how I will try attempting this question is from a viewpoint of a citizen. The concept of citizenship and the role of media, if we tend to look at pre-independence or during the time of India's independence movement. So the Indian media at that time, the press basically, and Indian the idea of citizenship, they went hand in hand, because the press was actually trying to manufacture the idea of citizenship, because before that we were subjects under so many small kingdoms or whatever, princely states. Now at that moment that happened, and because of that the Indian public sphere also somehow, as Hemabas says, right? So Indian public sphere became existent, and it played a very, very important role in making the citizens informed as well. And that's why we got independence in 1947. But now the problem is that the Indian media is not actually, like working on that project of active citizenship. Now we are citizenship, but are we active citizenship? Or do we even realize that we are citizenship and we have certain, civic...
So I
right?
would say that the major difference is that there was no market involved at that time when it was for the citizenship, and there was a social service kind of an element attached to journalism. But with the liberalization, with the integration of the corporate interests, it became a different thing in itself altogether. So journalism is not a kind of a service, or it doesn't care about developing and emancipating the citizens of the country as per the ideals of the Enlightenment. So it basically tries to dumb down. It goes to the level of the tastes of the audiences, and basically whatever they need, it goes basically as per that and aligns its values to that.
And exactly, I completely agree with you. But there is a ray of hope, I'll say. And three things actually, guard the failure of media, or we may say constructing or, cherishing or saving this idea of citizenship. And that is, one is the media regulatory bodies. The second is, at this moment, I'll say, the, citizen journalists. And the third is universities. Now, the first one, media regulatory bodies are failed miserably. Press Council of India, for example, nothing. They do nothing, right? Although they have all the reports with them and all, they are not doing anything. Only two hopes I have, and that is with the independent journalists these days, and the second is universities, university space. This is exactly, these two spaces are trying to discuss through various mediums the idea of citizenship, and not only that, but how we are attached with the country. And also they are debating, thankfully, the idea of what is nation, and from that what is nationality or nationalism. And thankfully there are like spaces which still debate this phrase that if you are not a nationalist, then you cannot be a journalist. So thankfully we have those two, at least these two spaces, which are trying to save the ideals of the country, the beautiful idea of ethical journalism, and at last the most beautiful idea of citizenship. So yeah.